Good day from Ohio, my friends. We are headed to the town of Mount Vernon. Daze with Jordan the Lion. It begins right now. Now off this little road, there's an abandoned building over here, and behind that, if you didn't know the cemetery is back here, you could completely miss it. This is where Paul Lynde is buried with his family. Here we are at Amity Cemetery. So right over here, very easy to find Paul Lynde, because it's a pretty big headstone and people have actually put photos of him out front. Say we miss you. There he is on Bewitched. He and Elizabeth were best friends. In fact, it was pretty much her that got him the part as Uncle Arthur on Bewitched. Then there, I bet his family probably did this, because it says, "Thanks for coming to see me in my hometown of Mount Vernon." So here he is. Paul Lynde. Looks like he's here with his brother and sister, because his parents are right next to him. Their death is very sad. Actually, everyone on this headstone is very sad. I'll go into that, but this was the hometown of Paul Lynde. He was born and raised here, and from the time he was a young man, he knew he wanted to be rich and famous, and that journey started right here. Paul's father was Hoy. And Hoy, for the early years of Paul's life, was the sheriff in Mount Vernon for 4 years. And so the family actually lived above the prison in town, and then his father became the town butcher. His mother she was a great woman. She prided herself on being a great cook, and she doted over her kids and always made sure that the household was happy and that everyone was well taken care of. And sadly, Paul, when he was a little kid, ended up having his appendix burst, and that caused him to have an illness that ended up putting him into bed. He was bedridden for a year, and because of his mom being such a great cook and her doting over him, he ended up gaining 100 pounds. And that was something that when he would eventually be able to leave his bed and go back to school, something that would kind of plague him throughout his life, because he was bigger than even, most of the heavy kids then. He was 260 pounds when he entered high school, and he was even in the marching band and decided to play the bass drum, because the bass drum was the only thing that he could find that was big enough to cover and kind of disguise the fact that his uniform didn't fit and he couldn't close his uniform. But he ended up becoming kind of a class clown because of that. He knew, if you can't beat him, join him. So he just decided to make fun of himself, and ended up becoming pretty popular while he was growing up, and even did theater while he was in school. And they kind of knew even then that he had a gift, that when he walked into a room, he could just bring this energy with him, and that kind of followed him through his whole career. The reason that I said the death of everyone over here in his family was extremely sad is because this is his brother Cordy, and you can see Cordy was in the military. Corydon Lynde. And Paul, growing up, said that he always felt like he was the nothing in the family. It's not that his family made him feel that way, but all of his brothers and his sister were so extraordinary at something, he felt like he was the only one that wasn't. And he always looked at Cordy as being the brave one. And Cordy went off and fought and was missing in action in the Battle of the Bulge. And for 5 years, they did not know what happened to Cordy and just kept waiting and waiting and waiting on word. And then eventually they found out that Corydon was gone. He had been missing in 1944, but that somehow in 1949, the military was able to get exact word, find out where his body was, and they told the family that Cordy was passed. When they told the family that Cordy passed, Paul's mother Sylvia died within weeks of a broken heart. She literally heart failure. So she passed away, Cordy was gone. 3 months later, they flew his body back here, had the ceremony out here, and then the very next day, Hoy died. So Paul lost his mother, his father, and his brother, seemingly all, you know, within a couple of months. And even though Paul, you know, his father was a butcher and Paul didn't like that, he didn't really, you know, he was not proud of that job. His father, you know, saw that Paul was different, and when Paul wanted to go to study theater, even though he didn't want him to and he didn't really support it, he did pay for it. So Paul did get to go live that dream and went to Northwestern, and his father paid for it the whole time he was there. And he was with people like Charlton Heston was in his class, Cloris Leachman, and Paul actually his senior year was voted the greatest actor of his class. So his family, his father, had agreed to help finance Paul to go to New York City to try and make it as an actor, and did that for a year. Paul wasn't having much success, but right at the end of that year was when all of this happened. So Paul went from being completely taken care of by his family to have no one taking care of him, and he really struggled. For the next year, he had a hard time paying his rent, finding money for food. He eventually started getting a little bit of work in New York, but he was still heavy, and he realized that that was probably the reason he wasn't getting work. So he worked very hard and ended up losing 100 pounds. He started getting some work and then wrote a comedy routine. He performed the comedy routine one night at an open mic contest, won, and was rewarded with a week-long residency at that place, and his career as a stand-up started to take off. Part of Paul's charm was that he was super witty, and so he had written his own routines and was very good, and they were very unique, and he had a very distinct speaking style. He was not a leading man type. He was more of what you consider a character actor, or a someone who had a very distinct thing about them that was good in small doses. So he just kept trying to get more leading parts, and for the next decade he would work on that in New York City, and would finally land a role in Bye Bye Birdie, where he would be a success on Broadway. Paul Lynde was an absolute smash in Bye Bye Birdie. He was so good that when they decided to make it a movie, he was one of 2 actors that they decided to keep on from the theater production in the movie. Now, he was great in the movie, but he didn't like the movie version because they cast Anne Margaret, and he felt like it went from being Bye Bye Birdie to being Hello Anne Margaret. In fact, he would say in interviews that he would even tell friends also, that he just thought they put songs at the beginning and end of the movie that featured Anne Margaret that were not originally part of it, and he just thought that made it focus so much on her it took away from everything else. But he started getting more work on television because he moved out to Los Angeles by this point, started earning a living by being on the Munsters and I Dream of Jeannie, and then got a bit part on Bewitched. And like I said, Elizabeth Montgomery ended up really loving Paul. He was supposed to be in an episode where he was her driving instructor, and she liked him so much that she talked her husband, who was the director of the show, into giving Paul a permanent job where he was Uncle Arthur. And he would actually spend a lot of his time when he wasn't filming hanging out with Elizabeth and her husband at their home. Now, unfortunately, what plagued Paul, even from the time he was young, is that he had no self-confidence, and that never changed. Even when he lost the weight, that never changed. He would even end up gaining the weight back and having to lose it again, and would struggle with that for a long time. But he also struggled with two other things. He was actually gay, and not that it was a problem or anything really, he couldn't be open about it because of the times. When he was in college, he would have been thrown out of school or arrested, they said. His friend said he ran that risk. But then when he got to Hollywood, nobody just really ever asked, and if they did ask, he would just say that he had a girl in his hometown that broke his heart and that he just never could fall in love again. But behind the scenes, his good friends knew that he liked men and that he always had, you know, men around him and everything. And he also loved to drink, and he couldn't just have one drink. He was okay with one drink, but if he had more than one, he became just very, very angry and mean and would just rip people to shreds with his words. It always bothered Paul that he was like a character actor. He was a side man, that he wasn't the lead man, because he felt like he had the ability and the talent to do that. And he actually had done several pilots for television shows, and they just didn't get picked up. They just weren't really featuring his talent, or people found out, you know, when they watched it, there's just a little bit too much of Paul for what they wanted, until he did like a Sherlock Holmes type show, which he said was possibly the greatest thing he ever did. And there was a chance that it was actually going to be picked up and everything, but Paul had a controversy where a male visitor had fallen out of a window and died. And apparently the story was, from Paul's friends, was that you know, that this guy was trying to show off to Paul and was showing him that he could hang outside of the balcony by his fingers and then pull himself back in. And when he tried to do it, he just wasn't able to pull himself back in. But Bruce Valanche would jokingly say, I mean, if you knew Paul in those days, his personality could change on a dime. You didn't really want to be near a window if he were there, because you didn't know if maybe he would push you. So apparently he had some really dark days, but because of that, they ended up not picking up his show, and he got offered Hollywood Squares. And when Hollywood Squares went on the air, Paul became the center square. He had writers that wrote very witty and funny clips or comments for him to make, and he ended up being on the show for 15 years. Now, he did decide at one point he wanted to leave Hollywood Squares, and so in the middle of the season he did. He left the show. Hollywood Squares ratings started to drop, so they begged Paul to come back. They offered him a huge raise, and he came back and stayed with the show until it went off the air. And then once it went off the air, it went into syndication, so he made money from that. Now, it was nice. I did find an interview with Dick Van Dyke, who was friends with Paul Lynde, and he said that at the end of Paul's life, Paul did sober up and actually would call Dick Van Dyke, trying to talk him into sobering up, telling him how quick-witted he felt and how you know, he felt like things were clearer now than they ever had been because he wasn't drinking and doing those kinds of things. But even though he had cleaned up and quit, at the end he ended up dying in his bed of a heart attack. He was actually doing a new television show, and the production crew came to pick him up for filming that day and noticed that his newspaper was still in the driveway. And they were actually, the director that day said, I thought, oh great, he just didn't come home last night, so he's not going to be here. And then later he said, I got a phone call from the sheriff saying that Paul had been found dead of a massive heart attack in his sleep. And the doctor who did the autopsy actually said Paul's heart was that of an 85-year-old at the time of his passing. I kept finding where people were saying that there was a hidden cause of death, and that actually there was a male lover who was there that night and escaped and got out of there, and he knows something, and that there were drugs and paraphernalia and things found and everything. But then the more I looked, I would see where they said that was actually all false. So I don't know whether that happened or not. I would see there's a book that I used to get a little bit of the research out of this, and I saw on the book reviews people complaining that in the book they didn't talk about that. And like I said, when I dug deeper, I found that that was all supposedly myth, that none of that was true. But knowing Paul's lifestyle, it wouldn't necessarily be out of the realm of possibility either. And look at how many people come out and visit him. Since 1982, he's had people coming out here all that time. That's quite an impact that you leave when people care 40 years later. And they have a little museum here that's open 3 days a week for 2 hours a day. I've tried to go to it several times, but I finally got this time. It is supposed to be open today, so I want to go see Paul Lynde's memorabilia. They even have his car here.